Okay, welcome back for the second half of our slides and a little narration, a little lecturing. And there we have the image for political sociology. We've talked about that already. One thing I can't do in VoiceThread is remotely move the slides, so I have to be closer to the mouse and move them manually, which I'm going to do. Okay, here we go. So we're going to pick up where we left off. And one of the things I wanted to mention was the way in which Janowitz situates the history of political sociology and basically divides it into people who focus on the social bases and people who focus on the institutional organizational. To some extent, this is a bit of a disciplinary distinction. That is, sociologists tend to focus on the social bases. Political scientists tend to focus on the institutional organizational. But ideally, there's some connection and overlap between them. And as I said, we want to be making those connections. In terms of the major classical sociological theorists, some of you are knowledgeable about these theorists based on the fact that you're sociology majors, but not everyone in the class is a sociology major. That's a good thing. We want different perspectives. So just so you know, we have many classical sociological theorists, but the big three, as I call them, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. All three had something to say that has enormous relevance for political sociology. Marx, in particular, clearly connected capitalism as a political economic system with the creation of social classes and social class antagonism and social class interests translated into political action. So that's where we would kind of situate Marx, certainly within these social factors. The institutional side is often associated more with Weber. That's Weber, pronounced Weber. Weber than Marx. And Weber did focus a lot of attention of his writings on what we would call broadly the institutions of the political system, the state or bureaucracy. He's very well known for his analysis of bureaucracy. And people who have followed in the Weberian model have talked about the way in which the state is autonomous in some ways from class forces and class interests. We'll get to that later. And the third, the often neglected third classical theorist is Emil Durkheim. And Durkheim was a social order theorist, if we want to categorize him in a particular way. And he did focus on the factors that contributed to social order, social harmony, consensus, what he called social integration. And I'm going to introduce various aspects of these theorists throughout the semester. So I'm just trying to connect them now with some of the strands of political sociology mentioned by Janowitz. As a way to kind of connect the two most significant theorists, classical theorists, and that is Marx and Weber. There's no question about that. I've just put together a little diagram, again, for people to start thinking about the way you connect what these different theorists do. Let me move my screen so I can see exactly what you are seeing, more or less. Okay, less. So you have the emergence of capitalism, and one of the aspects of capitalism that Weber emphasized was the emergence alongside capitalism of rational bureaucratic forms of organization. These are hierarchical forms of organization, and therefore within them you have owners, capitalist class, you have managers, and you have workers. Owners, the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. Managers, we'll talk about They occupy, in some ways, kind of a special category. And then workers, the proletariat, and the hierarchy in these organizations where the owners and the managers are exploiting the workers. So you have class exploitation. Out of class exploitation and out of the organization of work and the compensation for work, you have inequality. So I'm moving from left to right. In the top right corner, you have the emergence of inequality, class distinctions. Obviously, it's a capitalist society, a class society. You have these cleavages. That's the term that Janowitz uses to talk about social divisions. We'll have more to say about that in a moment. That's a term that isn't as widely used today as it was back when I was in graduate school in sociology and political science. People talked about cleavages rather than social class divisions. And of course, class consciousness, which Marx talked about in terms of the working class developing some sense of having a common interest in opposition to the capitalist class. So as you move down from the top right, the top right corner to the bottom right corner, this translates into political action. This is class conflict. This is certainly the heart of what Marx focused on in terms of what generates social change in the Marxist model, the conflict between classes. And that conflict is often organized through political parties, through labor organizations, etc. So again, you have this organizational component, you have the class component. I'm trying to bring these pieces of Marx and Weber together. And then ultimately, there are efforts by all of the social classes and organizations and political parties and labor organizations to somehow get the state, the government, to put in place policies which ultimately benefit them, their class interests. So what I'm trying to do here is give you a kind of illustration of how you can take some thoughts, some ideas, some concepts, some insights from Weber and then some from Marx, bring them together into a kind of model about how you think of the relationship between the political economic organization of capitalism, political movements, political action, and ultimately state policy. So I want you to begin to think in ways that allow you to make these kind of connections. Okay? All right. Okay. When I had students in other classes, so I'll just share this with you now, even though you may have not yet read Janowitz. And as I said, I'm not going to be covering the readings since you'll be writing about them, although I may make some reference to them. But some of the things that students had identified in the past when I did the reading writing assignment based on reading of Janowitz, they talked about the social bases, which we've talked about, and the social correlates, right? So this is interesting, the social bases and the social correlates. So the idea is that where you stand in the social structure, the class structure, race and ethnicity, gender, age, correlates with your level of political participation, the direction of your participation, whether you vote for one party or another. We begin to make connections. We begin to have expectations. We develop hypotheses that some groups are more likely to vote left than right. Some groups more likely to vote right than left. Okay? Political sociology. Political socialization. I talked about that briefly. One thing I do like to emphasize when we talk about the political socialization, and you can think of political socialization in any society, and certainly in the United States, as a form of indoctrination. Every nation, every country, every society attempts to essentially indoctrinate its population. You can call it socialization. You can call it propaganda. You can call it brainwashing. Use whatever term you want. The point is you want the population to think a certain way, to internalize certain beliefs. And from the perspective of the elite, those people who are in positions of power, You want those ideas that they internalize to be ideas that are consistent with the existing political economic arrangements of the society, not contrary to. You don't want to stimulate ideas and thoughts that are going to lead the population to question the existing arrangements. You want them to accept the existing arrangements, to regard them as just or fair, or sometimes as naturally emerging and evolving, rather than institutional arrangements that have been created by people, individuals, powerful people, to benefit them disproportionately in relationship to the rest of the society. I use this term, restraining myths. I think it comes from the political sociologist Richard Hamilton. And he talked about restraining myths as being ideas that people internalize. This is often a part of the socialization process to get people to believe these things. And if you believe those things, they're not necessarily true, they're not necessarily accurate, but when you internalize them, you are restrained. Important to understand that. Restraining myths. That is, you're restrained from asking difficult questions, questioning authority, taking political action in ways that would challenge the existing arrangements. So I have here restraining myth, empirically unfounded claims and beliefs that tend to demobilize collective action aimed at change. And I have some examples here. The idea of the American dream. It's open to everybody. Everybody can make it. People move up. They work hard. They're rewarded materially, and they live the American dream, the middle class existence. Talk more about the middle class concept. The idea of freedom, that we live in a society where everyone is free choice, free to do what they want. There are no constraints, equal opportunity. All of these are restraining myths. Okay? The idea of social mobility, that we live in a society where there's lots of social mobility. So all you have to do is put some effort, some energy, direct yourself in particular ways toward particular kinds of activities. Ultimately, no one needs to be deprived. No one needs to be at the bottom of the occupational stratification system. There's lots of social mobility up and down. A fluid class system. Tina, this is classic. There is no alternative. Get this from Margaret Thatcher, the neoliberal Prime Minister of Britain. There is no alternative. This is it. This form of capitalism, American capitalism, is the highest form of capitalism. It's evolved naturally this way, and it's the single best adaptation for human life. And there is really no alternative. Or what they'll tell you is, it's this, American capitalism, or tyranny. Those are your choices. Not much of a choice. So there is no, so all of these things are restraining myths. So I'm adding a little additional meat to the idea of socialization. The sociology of knowledge, closely connected to thinking about the social bases of politics. Karl Mannheim is a classical sociological theorist, not one that may be covered in the social theory course in the sociology department. I'm not sure. I don't teach that course. I don't know if Mannheim is mentioned. But Mannheim, the idea of sociology of knowledge is simply that how you understand the world, how you make sense of it. Knowledge, okay, is largely shaped by your social position, where you're located in the social structure. Okay? And so we all develop a different understanding of the world based on where we stand and where we stand in the social hierarchy, okay? In terms of race and ethnicity, or in terms of social class, or in terms of gender or age. They shape our understanding and, in turn, perhaps our political orientation. All right. A few other things that are discussed in Janowitz that students have identified. Now, notice I have the word concepts up here, and I should have highlighted that earlier. I'm asking you in the reading writing assignments to identify 2 or 3 concepts that you find in the readings that you find interesting. Make sure you know what a concept is. So we really have 2 concepts here. Okay? One is political alienation. That's a concept. It's kind of an abstract idea that people are not politically engaged, right? Or that they're estranged from politics. They're not participatory. It's a concept. Now, when I teach data analysis, we say we have concepts, right? And then we have ways to measure those concepts. And that's what political scientists do, right? So if somebody says there's a high level of political alienation, right, that's a concept. It's an interesting concept to describe the withdrawal from politics, the estrangement from the political arena, which is actually quite significant. I'm not talking about this in the Marxian term. That's a different kind of alienation, right? But there was a lot of research done on political alienation back in the 70s. I remember that. I think I took a political science course at the University of Florida. I think that was actually the title of the course, Political Alienation. Or maybe it was a course in political behavior, but they devoted a lot of time to political alienation. Maybe that's because at that time it was growing significantly in terms of people beginning to withdraw, higher levels of withdrawal, non-voting, less partisan party affiliation, those kinds of things. Now maybe it's just like we just take it for granted, right? And of course, some people benefit from the fact that a large percentage of the population is politically inactive. So political alienation, you might ask somebody, so how do we know if people are politically alienated, right? And so political scientists would create surveys and they would ask questions. For example, like, do you think either political party has your interest in mind? All right. If you say no, that's a form of political alienation, right? It's sort of turned off by the party system, by the political system generally. So there's lots of ways to do that. So when we talk about political alienation, disinterest, withdrawal, estrangement, as I said, inefficacy, that's a term that's widely used in political science. Do you have political efficacy? That's a concept. Political efficacy is a concept. What it means is, to what extent do you believe that your political actions matter, will have an impact? Okay? And there are lots of questions that political scientists have put in surveys that try to get at people's sense of political efficacy. If you have a high level of political efficacy, you're much more likely to be involved in politics because there's a payoff. You believe that it's actually worthwhile, that there's a return on the investment of your political activity. Now, one of the interesting aspects, and this gets us into Durkheim, which we've sort of short shrifted before, is that when there's high levels of political alienation, apathy, inactivity, you have this mass of people who simply are alienated from the political system, sometimes described as this mass society theory. We'll talk more about that. Durkheim talked about this problem, people being disconnected, not integrated to the political system, and therefore potentially subject to manipulation by demagogues, by elites who try to draw on their disaffection, finding scapegoats, finding explanations for their problems, mobilizing them in that way. This should sound familiar. We'll talk more about it. Middle majority politics. Now, remember, I talked before about the period when there was high levels of upward mobility. The middle class was expanding, right? In bourgeoisement. Working class people becoming middle class, becoming bourgeois, so to speak. lifestyle, maybe an outlook, maybe in political perspective. So the idea of middle majority politics was viewed as a positive thing because it reduced levels of polarization. More and more people seemed to be having success economically. The middle was expanding, large numbers of people, large percent of the population falling within this middle class category, seeing the world in a similar way, etc. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this middle class expansion versus middle class contraction, right? So the post-war boom, we call it, basically 1945 to let's say 1975, okay? Maybe 1970. Things got a little rocky in the mid 70s. And we'll talk about that next week. But the point is that that was the period of the most prolific expansion of capitalism in United States history. Lots of upward mobility, and so you had this expanding middle. So I'm trying to show this graphically. What it looks like is diamond, right? And the idea was that there was a consensus growing. People were basically, there wasn't a lot of ideological polarization. People pretty much agreed on the way the society should be organized, etc. And that was presumably a good thing. There were still a lot of tensions back then, and there were a lot of issues that were unresolved. Okay, but that's what they meant by the middle majority, this growth in the middle class. So think about that. Okay, again, this is a sociological phenomenon of upward mobility, the expansion of the middle class, having enormous political consequences. Probably since about 1980s, 1990s, we've had a shrinking of the middle class. I have a little data here that you can look at, but there's lots of data available on income distribution, what sectors are growing, what sectors are getting smaller, what quintiles within the income distribution have lost income, which have gained income, etc. And there's all kinds of books that have been written. You could go online and just type in shrinking middle class, disappearing middle class. You find lots of articles. Okay. So today what we find is something I'm trying to replicate, an image that would reflect the changes that have taken place more recently. And what you see is the majority of people down at the bottom. Okay, right? We go from the diamond to the hourglass. But it's not a proportional hourglass in the sense that those at the top are small, but they control more and more. So think about that not as the size of the amount of money they possess, but as the size of the population. Under those conditions, we might expect more polarization, more conflict. I mean, after all, we have today the highest level of income and wealth inequality in our history. Most people would have expected this to produce enormous political conflict. Much more dramatic political conflict than anything we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years, right? We have partisan conflict, but I'm talking about serious, fundamental, radical, revolutionary conflict. That hasn't happened. But we have had some interesting political developments over the last 4 years or so. We'll talk about those. I don't think I want to spend too much time on this. We talk about the bourgeoisie. We talk about the proletariat. Marx kind of developed a two-class model. Talked about the capitalist class, control the means of production, own the factories, own the productive property, and the proletariat that owns no property that produces income. If they have to survive, they must sell their labor power for a wage. And so we have those two classes, and we think about the political dynamics there. The assumption is that the bourgeoisie is relatively conservative, wants to preserve the system, and supports policies of the state that reinforce capitalism. and reinforce it through policies, and also reinforce it through the oppression of the working class. The proletariat, on the other hand, in the Marxist model, presumably has an interest in overturning the capitalist system because they're being exploited and they get less of what they produce than the value of their production. Okay, so there's the exploitation, there's the subordination, and this presumably will, over time, develop into a collective interest among working class people to demand, organize, and change the society in a way that addresses their subordinate, exploited status. Eric Olin Wright was one of the great sociologists of the last, I would say, 30 to 40 years. He passed away tragically recently. He acquired some medical issue, and it's a huge loss to sociology. We will be reading a few of his articles in this class. Eric Olin Wright, you can look him up if you're interested. He was a Marxist sociologist. What he was trying to do with his work was to show that we needed a somewhat more detailed way to think about class than just the two-class model, that there were these, what he called contradictory classes or contradictory class locations. That is, people that were situated somewhere between the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, or just petite, petite capitalists, small capitalists, okay? So let me just give one example, and that's managers, right? So managers, on the one hand, managers are hired by capitalists. So in that sense, they sell their labor power for a wage, maybe a salary, maybe some stock options, but they don't own the means of production. So on the one hand, they're sort of like workers. On the other hand, they control workers in the interest of the capitalist class, in the interest of the bourgeoisie, right? So Eric Olin Wright was interested in these groups that fell somewhere in between. He said they have 1 foot in the bourgeoisie, 1 foot in the proletariat, 1 foot in the working class, 1 foot in the capitalist class. Which way do they go? When push comes to shove, politically, will they identify with the proletariat? Will they identify with the bourgeoisie? So he was interested in looking at these segments of the class structure. And for him, class is not, how much money you make, okay? It's not how you feel, like, what class do you think you belong in? There's a set of questions that he put into his surveys. He was not just a theoretical political sociologist, but he was an empirical political sociologist. So he gathered a lot of data. Do you own the means of production or not? Do you own productive property? Yes or no? No. Do you supervise labor? Yes or no? You say no. Do you have skills that permit independence from a capitalist, right? These semi-autonomous workers? No. You say no to all three of those, you're a working class person. You say yes to those, you're a capitalist, okay? So he was trying to refine what is sometimes regarded as a relatively crude two-class model in Marx. Okay, a few other concepts that were mentioned. Students found these interesting. I hope you will also check out the Janowitz reading, of course. Say something about it. The iron law of oligarchy. Lots of students find that an interesting concept because it's an iron law. There aren't too many iron laws in sociology. That is things that we know for sure always happen. There's lots of tendencies. There's correlations. There's associations. But an iron law. So the iron law was something that Michels, that's the way you pronounce his name, Robert Michels, studied some organizations, and he found that almost in every organization, inevitably, a small number of individuals become the decision makers, the most powerful over time. And so he thought that there was sort of this natural tendency in all organizations for oligarchy to emerge. We're going to talk much more about oligarchy because it is a concept that can be used to describe the American political system today, not just an organization, but the entire American political system. Do we have an oligarchy in the United States? That's a term people associate with, less developed countries, Latin American countries. Is there an oligarchy? A small group dominates decision-making and policy in the United States, whose interests are advanced by government, and where there are no policies put in place that contradict their interests. Societal strain theory. This goes back to this is more of a Durkheimian idea, and that is that you have lots of people with wishes and desires and demands, and they want the government to satisfy those demands, and it puts a strain on the system because the government can't process and manage all of the demands that are placed on it. And so there are certain institutions that mediate the demands. Political parties are designed to mediate the demands, to translate the demands of the population, articulate those, and then represent them through government policy. And public opinion and ideology, we will talk about all of these. Okay, so societal strain is a concept or a theory. Okay, so when I say in the reading and writing assignments, identify a theory, identify a concept. Iron Law of Oligarchy, that would be one as well. You might find that interesting. Okay, consensus and or cleavage. So this is, at one time, this was kind of a debate in political sociology, right? So what were the larger tendencies in the society? Was it toward consensus over time, where, the society would develop economically and people's needs would be met, and eventually people would largely agree on the kind of society they wanted to live in. There was less conflict, more harmony, more social order, or did you have these cleavages? Okay, that's the term they use, cleavage. These social divisions between groups based on gender, class, race and ethnicity, generation, whatever you want to call it. So you can talk about mutually reinforcing cleavages, right? That's one way. That's a terminology that used to be mutually reinforcing cleavage. So if you have a society with mutually reinforcing cleavages, you're probably going to have a lot of conflict. And what that means is that your racial status and your gender and your class and your education, all three of those put you in a position of subordination. Okay? That is, they reinforce each other. A cross-cutting cleavage is where you have one status, maybe it's a subordinate status, but you also have another status that gives you a perspective that is different than being working class. So I have an example here of, the two examples I have is race, black and white, class, so working class black, right? Mutually reinforcing forms of subordination, okay? Cross-cutting cleavage, religion and class. You have working class, that tends to provide a certain radicalism, presumably, but you're a working class Catholic. Well, Catholicism might be a moderating effect on your radicalism, okay? So if they cross-cut, presumably that's a good thing. You want a society where there are cross-cutting cleavages for people that are worried about social order. I think I have a little diagram of this. Okay. So this is a stylized, simplified binary stratification model. So sex, race, class, the name of the course in sociology. Male, female. And I'm assuming that male is, females are subordinate to males based on patriarchy. Race, black subordinate to whites based on institutionalized, systematic, long periods of white supremacy and racism. Okay, capitalist and worker. Right. So my point here is that a mutually reinforcing cleavage situation would be a female black worker. Okay. Now you would expect somebody that had those three statuses to be more extreme, so to speak, in their political perspective. You might expect them to be more radical than a white male capitalist. You understand the point? Okay. So when people think about the combinations of these different statuses that people have, sometimes they're mutually reinforcing, producing intense political orientations. Sometimes they're cross-cutting, which tends to weaken and make less predictable their political orientation. So I write some of the examples here, like a white female is less left radical than a black female. That would be maybe a hypothesis you would have based on what you know about subordination and the way subordination translates into political orientation. Black worker, more radical left than a black capitalist. Okay, they share racial identity, but they're in different social classes. Okay. So that's when you see this stuff about cleavages. That's what we're talking. So there was a celebration back, in like the 50s and the 1960s. Middle majority. Everyone's middle class. We don't have any conflict anymore. Of course, it was still a capitalist society. The middle class was still working. They were still being exploited. Okay. So this was the kind of social science that tended to obscure the actual divisions that existed in the society. But it was very, very widely subscribed to by sociologists and political scientists, except those who were more left, radical, critical, like C. Wright Mills, for example. We'll talk about C. Wright Mills. Daniel Bell wrote a book called The End of Ideology. We've come to a certain point in history where ideology is irrelevant. Didn't quite work out the way he thought. Okay. Somebody wrote more recently a book called The End of History. This was after the Soviet Union collapsed. Fukuyama said, at the end of history, the last man, history is over. Liberal capitalism of the largely American style is dominant. This is the ultimate end of history. This is the system that has prevailed. Okay, I just heard some thunder and lightning, and I don't want the power to go out. Here's a cautionary note from Janowitz. I think it's important. This goes back to when I was talking about normative attachments. And he said differences between the kind of theories that people subscribe to reflect differences in social values and consumptions of political philosophy. Right? He said it's too crude to label social stratification theories as radical, institutional theories as moderate. The most that can be stated is that some theorists who emphasize one in their view of political sociology are committed to comprehensive ideological positions of political change. I would fall into that category. The theories that I select, the perspectives I like to talk about, write about, share with students are connected to my thoughts about social change and the improvement of the human condition. All right. Let's see. Okay, so let me just finish by looking at a few tables. And the reason I'm showing you these tables is to give you some idea of what we mean by the relationship between social position, class position, the social bases of politics. What does it mean to say the social correlates, right? It means that a class position should be correlated with the political orientation, for example. So if you look here, now we have two variables. This is from the General Social Survey, which is a widely used survey in the social sciences. And students use this data set in my data analysis class. So look at this table, and you should be able to answer this question, and then I'll just say something about it. What percent of people who identify subjectively, okay, you ask people, place yourself in the social class you think you belong in. Okay, it's subjective social class. This is not the way Eric Olin Wright okay, would look at social class. So just understand that for the moment. What percent of those who are identify as working class, also liberal? Okay, what percent of those who identify working class are liberal in their political orientation? Because you also ask them to identify their political orientation. That's 25.9%. Right? Now, remember, usually we would expect the working class to be more left than the upper class. Is that hypothesis confirmed? I'm going to give you a minute to look, right? Now, what are you going to compare? You're going to compare the working class. Let's see, 25.9% of the working class is liberal. And what percent of the upper class? What? 39.7. The upper class is more liberal than the working class. Now, that seems to kind of contradict the expectations. This is why you need to think about how people perceive survey questions, right? First of all, we have subjective social class. So this is where people place themselves, right? But let's assume that people are placing themselves in some sense accurately. The question is, why is the upper class more liberal than the working class? Well, I think it has a lot to do with how people interpret the term liberal in American politics. So in this class, what we're going to discover is that increasingly upper class individuals, and many of those upper class individuals have high levels of education, tend to be much more liberal, okay, or respond positively to the label liberal than people in the working class. Now, there's a difference between liberal and left, okay? Left social democratic politics is not necessarily the same as what we think of as liberal in the United States. Okay. All right. We're going to talk a little more about these terms. Okay. But this is one way somebody would demonstrate the relationship between social position, political orientation. Let's just look at a few other slides. This is all for illustrative purposes. All right, so here we have Democrats, Independents, Republicans, okay? Party ID. To what extent does social class predict a party identification? Now, again, you would expect the working class to be more likely to be Democratic than what is described, or the self-placement of people who are in the upper class. You don't see much difference here at all. But let's go down to the Republican. What percent of people who say they're working class are Republican? Can you find that in the table? It is, I have to strain my eyes, 11.8% versus 17.9% of the upper class. Now that is in line, that is more in line with the kind of expectations we would have. Okay, we'll have more we can say about each one of these. Now, let's get at the heart of the matter. Okay, so rather than liberal conservative, let's see, what percent of the working class strongly agree that inequality exists for the benefit of the rich? Take a look at the lower class. What percent of people who say they're in the lower class believe that inequality exists for the benefit of the rich? 27%. The upper class, 17.9%. Now, one thing you would want to do here is let's add up the percentage, let's say of the lower class, that strongly agrees and agrees. So there you're talking about 27 plus 37. That's 64% versus Let's compare it to the upper class, 28.2 plus 17.9. You begin to see some sharp differences. So the point is that liberal conservative question and the way people think about liberal and conservative is very different than when you start asking questions about inequality, about distribution of income, about power. Then you begin to see the divisions somewhat in a way that's more consistent. Look, we know in the United States there are many working class people that support the Republican Party. Some people think that's a paradox. Right? We're going to talk about that next week, why that phenomenon exists within American politics. What about race? Okay. Blacks are more likely, not by a lot, to identify as liberal. Let's go down to the conservative. What percent of whites identify as conservative? 36%. Percent of blacks, 22. Okay. There are expectations about race and politics, obviously, and we will devote some energy to that. Let's see. Okay, here's a good one, right? On race. Inequality exists for the benefit of the rich. Blacks much more likely to strongly agree than whites. Lived experience shapes political outlooks. Now, here's an important point. Notice the relationship between education and identifying as a liberal. The category that is most likely to identify as liberal is the most highly educated category. So you have to ask yourself, what are they thinking about when they think about the term liberal? Probably socially liberal, not necessarily economically liberal, socially liberal. Remember, those two dimensions, quite different. We will explore that and the implications of that for American politics. It's very, very critical. Social liberalism versus economic liberalism. Support for abortion under any condition if a woman wants it for any reason. This is a form of social liberalism. And notice the relationship between those who say yes and education. It goes from the lowest, which is less than high school, to people who have a graduate degree, 65.9%. See what I'm getting at here? Education is correlated with income, obviously, and high income people that are also highly educated and credentialed tend to be more socially liberal, not necessarily economically liberal. Okay, this is the last item. This is a different way to look at some of the issues and the extent to which Hillary voters and Donald Trump voters in 2016 are close together or far apart. It's interesting, and I think somewhat humorous, and maybe it's cynical, but notice that view that politics is a rigged game. The view that they both pretty much agree with that, right? And they're very close together. Importance of Social Security and Medicare. Okay? The importance of it. Okay, not that far apart. Where are they furthest apart? Look down at the bottom. Attitudes toward government intervention. Those who supported Hillary to the left, Trump far to the right. Attitudes toward economic inequality. I'm going from the bottom up. Again, quite a distance. Attitudes on immigration. Not a surprise there, given the importance of that issue in mobilizing Trump voters. So there's a lot of variation in terms of people's perspective based on issues, right? Just breaking it down by the particular issue. You will see large divisions, cleavages, okay? Polarization. Other areas, less so. Attitudes on gender roles, not that far apart. Okay? They're pretty much in the direction you would expect. Take a look at this, and where is it that the Trump supporters are actually more on the left side of the spectrum than Hillary supporters? It's very interesting. That's where the red dot is to the left of the blue dot. Let's see. Attitudes on foreign trade. Very interesting. We'll say more about that. Because when Trump was running, 2016, he emphasized the trade deals that the United States had signed, NAFTA in particular, and the impact that had on working people and how it ultimately hurt them badly, especially in, not insignificantly, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, the three states that ultimately decided the election through the Electoral College. Okay. Pretty fascinating. All right. I will close there. I just wanted to give you a little flavor of some data and how we think about the relationship between social position, political orientation, political attitudes on a very wide range of issues. Hopefully this has piqued your interest. Hopefully you find something we've discussed among the wide range of things that political sociology explores interesting. Any questions? Of course, you can post them within the slides. Hopefully you have. Hopefully you're using VoiceThread. And you can also, of course, post thoughts and questions in the discussion area. I'll sign off now.